The morning of August 17th, 1944 broke clear and bright over the Norman countryside near the village of Trun. For Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 2nd Panzer Division, the beautiful weather was not a blessing, it was a death sentence. He stood beside his Panther tank, watching the eastern horizon lighten to a pale blue that promised perfect visibility for miles. In the pre-dawn darkness, he had counted what remained of his once proud company. 7 tanks. 7. From the 45 Panthers his battalion had rolled into Normandy with barely 2 months earlier. And now, in these rolling hills between Falaise and Chambois, with Allied forces closing from 3 directions, Weber understood with absolute clarity that those 7 would never see Germany again. The question was no longer whether they would survive, it was how long they could last once the sun climbed high enough for the Allied fighter bombers to see them. 4 hours. That was what his division commander had estimated the previous evening. 4 hours to withdraw 20 kilometers through the narrowing escape route before Canadian and American forces sealed it completely. 4 hours to move nearly 15,000 men, hundreds of vehicles, and whatever remained of 5 panzer divisions through a gap that was shrinking by the minute, and all of it under skies that belonged entirely to the enemy. Weber had fought in Poland, in France, across the Russian steppe from Moscow to Kursk. He had faced 34s in numbers that darkened the horizon, had endured Katyusha rocket barrages that turned the earth inside out, had watched entire battalions disappear into the meat grinder of Stalingrad. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was about to unfold. Nothing had prepared him for the systematic annihilation that Allied air power could deliver. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The promise of German armoured superiority had defined Weber's career. He had been 23 years old when he first climbed into a Panzer IV in 1939, a lieutenant fresh from the officer academy at Potsdam. The doctrine was clear, almost intoxicating in its confidence: combined arms warfare, blitzkrieg. The tank was the tip of the spear, supported by dive bombers that functioned as flying artillery, protected by fighters that swept enemy aircraft from the sky. The formula had worked with devastating effectiveness in Poland, where the Polish cavalry had been crushed in days. It had worked in France, where supposedly impregnable defensive lines had been outflanked and bypassed before the French could react. Even in Russia, for those first terrible, triumphant months of 1941, the panzer divisions had driven deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies in pockets that made Falaise look modest by comparison. But the fundamental assumption underlying all of it, the bedrock principle that made armoured warfare viable, was that your tanks would have cover from above. Dive bombers and fighters were not mere support. They were essential components of the combined arms system. Remove them, and tanks became something else entirely. Not mobile assault guns, not breakthrough weapons, just large, slow-moving targets whose armour meant nothing against bombs dropped from 3,000 feet. Weber had first noticed the shift at Kursk in July of 1943. The Luftwaffe had been present, certainly, but spread thin, outnumbered. For the first time in his career, he had spent entire days watching the sky more than the terrain ahead, flinching at every aircraft silhouette, knowing that if it was not German, his tank's thick frontal armour would provide exactly zero protection. The pattern had continued through the long retreat across Ukraine, through the frantic defensive battles of early 1944. The skies had belonged less and less to Germany, more and more to the enemy. By the time his division had been transferred to France in June to resist the Allied invasion, the Luftwaffe's presence in the West had become almost theoretical. They existed somewhere, presumably, but not here, not where it mattered, not over the battlefield. American and British air forces, while numerous, lacked the coordination for effective ground support. Their tactics were crude, their pilots inadequately trained for precision strikes against moving armoured targets. The panzer divisions would operate at night and during poor weather, minimizing exposure. German anti-aircraft batteries would provide protection during daylight movement. Above all, the mission was temporary. Hold the line in Normandy long enough for the vaunted secret weapons to turn the tide, long enough for political fractures to appear in the unnatural alliance between capitalist democracies and communist Russia, long enough for Germany to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. Those reassurances had died in the hedgerows. Weber had lost his first tank to a Hawker Typhoon rocket on June 12th, 6 days after the Allied landings. He had not even seen the aircraft approach, just the sudden screaming roar, the flash of rockets leaving their rails, the metallic shriek of shaped charge warheads punching through armor plate that was supposed to be impervious to anything short of another tank's gun. His gunner had been killed instantly. His loader had burned to death before Weber and the driver could pull him from the flames. Weber himself had walked away with burns on his hands and a ringing in his ears that persisted for weeks. The replacement tank had lasted 11 days before a P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed its engine with a perfectly placed bomb. He had gone through 4 tanks in 6 weeks, 4 tanks, each, representing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks in industrial production, each requiring 6 men who could not be easily replaced, each supposedly protected by armor that rendered it nearly invincible in ground combat. By August, the delusion had become impossible to maintain. The Americans had broken out from their beachhead near Avranches, and General Patton's Third Army was racing through the gap, meeting minimal resistance. Hitler had ordered a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, a thrust toward the coast to cut off the American spearhead, restore the front line, and regain the initiative. 4 Panzer divisions, including Weber's, had been assembled for the offensive. 75 Panzer IVs, 70 Panthers, 32 assault guns. Against any ground force, it would have been formidable. Against the Allied air forces, it was suicide. The attack had been launched on August 7th, near the town of Mortain. American intelligence, reading German radio communications as easily as if they had been sent by telegram, had known it was coming. American infantry had prepared defensive positions. American artillery had plotted firing coordinates. And when the panzers advanced in the pre-dawn darkness, the American troops had simply held their ground and waited for sunrise. Weber would remember that morning for the rest of his life. The sky had been overcast, offering hope that weather might ground the Allied aircraft. For 3 hours, his battalion had made slow but steady progress, grinding through American positions, bypassing strong points, pushing toward the objective. And then, shortly after 10 o'clock, the clouds had begun to break. Patches of blue had appeared, and with them, the typhoons had come. He had watched from an orchard southwest of Mortain as the first wave had arrived. A dozen aircraft, flying low enough that he could see the invasion stripes painted on their wings and fuselage. Black and white bands that declared, with absolute arrogance, that these aircraft owned the sky so completely they did not even need camouflage. They were struck with rockets, 8 60-pound warheads per aircraft, launched from rails mounted under the wings. The projectiles had streaked toward the German column with a sound like tearing canvas, detonating with flashes that momentarily whited out Weber's vision even from several hundred meters away. 3 tanks had been destroyed in that first pass. A 4th had been immobilized, its track blown off. The crews of 2 others had bailed out, abandoning perfectly functional vehicles rather than remain in what had become metal coffins, and the typhoons kept coming, wave after wave, throughout the entire day. August 7th had become what the British pilots would later call the Day of the Typhoon, when 294 sorties had been flown in support of a single American division. Weber's battalion had essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force by mid-afternoon. Of 41 tanks that had begun the attack, fewer than a dozen remained operational by nightfall. The division commander had reported to Army Group Headquarters that the offensive had been brought to a standstill by the employment of fighter bombers by the enemy and the absence of our own air support. It was perhaps the most devastating admission a panzer general could make. The most powerful ground weapons in the Wehrmacht arsenal had been stopped not by enemy tanks, not by anti-tank guns, but by aircraft. By a threat they could not effectively engage, could not hide from, could not outmaneuver. The withdrawal from Mortain had been chaotic, but at least partially successful. Darkness had provided cover. The American forces, having successfully defended, had not immediately pursued. Weber's survivors had fallen back to join the defensive perimeter being hastily assembled around Falaise, where Canadian and British forces were pressing from the north, while American units swung around from the south and east. By August 12th, it had become obvious to every German soldier in Normandy that encirclement was imminent. The Allies were forming a pocket, a kessel, just as the Germans had done to Soviet armies in 1941, except this time the Germans were the ones being surrounded. And unlike the vast Russian plains, where pockets could be 50 or even 100 kilometers wide, the Norman countryside offered limited room for maneuver. The escape route was narrowing rapidly, compressed between Allied forces converging from multiple directions. Hitler's orders had been explicit: no withdrawal, hold the line, counterattack. The logic, such as it was, seemed to be that abandoning Normandy would lead to abandoning France, which would lead to invasion of the Reich itself. Better to stand and fight, to force the Allies into costly frontal assaults, to buy time for miracle weapons that might yet change the war's trajectory. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, had protested. The forces trapped in Normandy represented the core combat strength of the German army in the west. Lose them, and there would be no defensive line anywhere between the Norman coast and the German border. But Hitler had been unmoved, and the orders had remained in force until August 16th, when even the Führer had been forced to acknowledge reality. By then, it was almost too late. Perhaps it was entirely too late. The gap was only a few kilometers wide and getting narrower by the hour. Weber's division had been positioned on the southern shoulder of the escape route, assigned to hold open the corridor while other units withdrew. It was, he understood, a mission with minimal chance of survival. The Canadians were pressing from the north. American units were advancing from the south, and over all of it, dominating everything, was the constant, unrelenting presence of Allied aircraft. He had tried to explain it to his younger officers, the ones who had joined the unit after the Mortain debacle. They understood tanks, they understood infantry tactics, artillery fire, the brutal immediacy of ground combat, but they could not quite grasp what air supremacy meant until they experienced it themselves. It was not like artillery, which fired from fixed positions and could be targeted, could be suppressed, could at least be fought. Aircraft came from everywhere and nowhere. They appeared without warning, struck with terrible precision, and vanished before you could react. There was no defence except to hide, and in the open Norman countryside, with its gentle hills and sparse tree cover, there was nowhere to hide. The previous afternoon, a staff officer from divisional headquarters had arrived with updated orders. The withdrawal would begin at dawn. All units would converge on the road network between Trun and Chambois, the last remaining escape route. Speed was essential. Allied forces were expected to close the gap completely within 24 to 48 hours. Any unit that failed to reach the Seine within that time frame would be captured or destroyed. The staff officer had not mentioned the air attack. He had not needed to. Everyone knew. The roads would be killing grounds. The only question was how many would get through. Weber had assembled his remaining tank commanders after dark. 7 Panthers, 61 men counting the crews, and some attached infantry who had lost their vehicles. He had looked at their faces in the dim light of a shielded lantern, seeing his own fear reflected back at him. These were not the fresh-faced enthusiasts of 1939. Most of them were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived battles that had annihilated entire divisions. They knew what was coming. They had all seen what Typhoons and Thunderbolts could do. He had tried to offer something resembling encouragement. The division would provide anti-aircraft support. The route had been reconnoitred. They would move in. Dispersed formation. Maximum spacing between vehicles. Ready to scatter into whatever cover existed if aircraft appeared. Every man needed to be ready to abandon his vehicle and continue on foot if necessary. The priority was reaching the Seine. Tanks could be replaced. Men with combat experience could not. None of them had been fooled. Anti-aircraft guns were worse than useless against low-flying fighter bombers. The gunners were exposed. The weapons lacked the traverse speed to track fast-moving aircraft, and opening fire simply drew more attention. Dispersed formation meant tanks would be isolated, unable to provide mutual support if ground forces attacked. And abandoning vehicles meant walking 20 kilometers through enemy-controlled territory with minimal supplies and no heavy weapons. It was a plan born of desperation, not military logic, but it was the only plan they had. Now, as dawn approached on the 17th, Weber watched his men preparing for what they all knew would both come. Tank crews checked their vehicles one final time, not because it would make a difference, but because routine provided comfort in the face of the incomprehensible. Infantry checking ammunition they would likely never fire. Everyone glanced at the sky, watching the darkness fade, knowing that with the light would come the aircraft. The column began moving at 5:30, just as the first grey light appeared in the east. Weber's company was positioned near the middle of the divisional formation, which stretched for several kilometers along the narrow country road. Ahead and behind, he could see other vehicles. Half-tracks, supply trucks, artillery pieces being towed by whatever tractors had survived the fighting. Somewhere in that column were the remnants of 4 other Panzer divisions: the 1st SS, the 9th SS, the 10th SS, the 116th, all of them reduced to fragments of their original strength, all of them trying to squeeze through the same narrow corridor before it closed, completely. For the first 2 hours, the withdrawal proceeded with surprising smoothness. The road, though clogged with traffic, remained passable. No Allied aircraft appeared. Weber allowed himself a brief moment of hope. Perhaps the weather would remain overcast. Perhaps the Allied air forces had exhausted their capabilities during the previous days of continuous operations. Perhaps, by some miracle, they would reach the Seine. Then, at 7:41, the sun broke through the cloud cover. And 4 minutes later, the first Typhoons arrived. Weber heard them before he saw them, a low, growing roar that was distinct from the rumble of tank engines and truck exhausts. It came from the west, from behind the Allied lines, and it grew rapidly louder. He twisted in the commander's cupola of his Panther, scanning the sky, and then he saw them. 4 aircraft in a loose formation, flying perhaps 200 meters above the ground, following the road like wolves tracking a blood trail. The lead Typhoon rolled into its attack run, and Weber felt his stomach contract. There was something obscene about how leisurely it seemed, how unhurried. The pilot had all the time in the world to line up his shot, to select his target, to release his weapons. The German column could not shoot back effectively, could not maneuver off the narrow road without bogging down in the soft Norman soil, could not do anything except continue forward and hope the rockets were aimed at someone else. The first salvo struck a supply truck 400 meters ahead of Weber's position. The vehicle simply disintegrated, transformed in an instant from a functional machine carrying ammunition and rations into a fireball that sent black smoke boiling into the morning air. The truck behind it swerved, trying to avoid the wreckage, and slid off the road into a ditch. Men were scrambling from vehicles now, abandoning the column, running for the sparse tree lines and shallow ditches that offered the illusion of protection. The Typhoons made a second pass, their 20mm cannons raking the road, tearing through thin-skinned vehicles, killing men who had no cover, no defense, no chance. Weber's driver was shouting something, asking for orders, but Weber had no orders to give. Stop, and they would be a stationary target. Continue forward, and they would simply be the next vehicle in line for destruction. He ordered the Panther to pull off the road, to maneuver toward a cluster of farm buildings 300 meters to the north. If they could reach cover, if they could wait out the attack, perhaps they could continue the withdrawal after the aircraft departed. They never reached the buildings. A second flight of Typhoons appeared, and this time they were specifically hunting armor. Weber watched in horror as the lead aircraft banked sharply, dropping toward his Panther. He screamed at his crew to bail out, but his voice was lost in the shriek of the diving aircraft. The rockets left, their rails with flashes of ignite, 8 projectiles tracking toward his tank, and Weber threw himself from the cupola, hitting the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. The warheads struck the Panther's turret and hull in a cascading sequence of detonations that sounded like the end of the world. Shaped charge jets punched through armor that could defeat any Allied tank gun at normal combat ranges. The internal ammunition storage detonated in a secondary explosion that lifted the turret completely off the hull, flipping it end over end before it crashed down 20 meters away. Of Weber's crew, only he and the driver survived. The gunner, loader, and radio operator simply ceased to exist, vaporized or incinerated in the fraction of a second between the rocket impacts and the ammunition explosion. Weber lay in the dirt, his ears ringing, his vision blurred, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue. Around him, the road had become hell. Vehicles were burning along a 2-kilometer stretch, black smoke rising in columns that marked each destroyed target. Men were scattered across the fields, some running, some crawling, some lying motionless. And still the aircraft came. Wave after wave, Typhoons and Thunderbolts, each flight spending perhaps 15 or 20 minutes over the target area before returning to base to refuel and rearm, only to be replaced by fresh aircraft that continued the slaughter. He forced himself to stand, to assess the situation. His Panther was destroyed. Of the 7 tanks that had begun the withdrawal with him 3 hours earlier, he could see 4 burning nearby. 2 others had been abandoned by their crews, who had scattered into the fields. The 7th was nowhere to be seen, possibly destroyed beyond the range of his vision, possibly still intact somewhere in the chaos. His company no longer existed as a functional unit. 61 men had started the withdrawal. How many remained alive? 20? 30? He had no way to know. A Feldwebel from one of the other tank crews materialized beside him, bleeding from a scalp wound, his uniform torn and scorched. The sergeant was shouting something about regrouping, about continuing on foot, but Weber could barely hear him over the ringing in his ears and the constant drone of aircraft engines. The sergeant grabbed his arm, pointing toward a tree line 400 meters to the east, and Weber understood. If they stayed on the road, or near it, they would die. Their only chance was to abandon the vehicles entirely, to move cross-country, to reach the Seine by any route that avoided the killing ground the main road had become. They gathered survivors as they ran. Weber's driver, 3 men from another Panther crew, a handful of infantry who had been riding on the back of a half-track, a wounded artillery lieutenant who could barely walk. 18 men total, moving in groups of 2 or 3, trying to stay spread out, trying to be small and insignificant, and, beneath the notice of the aircraft that dominated the sky, it took them 6 hours to cover 10 kilometers. 6 hours of creeping through fields and along hedgerows, of hiding whenever aircraft appeared, of bypassing roads entirely because the roads were dead. Twice they encountered other groups of survivors, German soldiers from half a dozen different units, all moving east, all having abandoned their vehicles and most of their equipment. A major from the 12th SS Panzer Division told them that the gap was closing faster than expected. Polish armour had seized the high ground near Mont-Ormel, overlooking the escape route. Canadian forces had entered Trun. American units were pressing toward Chambois from the south. The corridor was now less than 3 kilometers wide, and it was under direct observation and constant artillery fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Weber's group reached the Dives River at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The river was not particularly wide or deep, but it represented a critical obstacle because there were only 2 places where vehicles could cross. One was a bridge at St. Lambert-sur-Dives, which was under heavy fire from Canadian tanks and artillery. The other was a ford southwest of Moissy, which had become a bottleneck where thousands of German soldiers and hundreds of vehicles were attempting to squeeze through under constant air attack. The scene at the ford was beyond description. Vehicles lined both banks, some waiting for their turn to cross, others abandoned, still others burning. Dead horses and dead men choked the shallow water. The air stank of gasoline and cordite and decomposing flesh that had been baking in the August heat. And overhead, the Typhoons and Thunderbolts continued their methodical work, each attacking aircraft adding to the carnage, turning the bottleneck into an abattoir. Weber led his men across the river on foot, wading through water that came to their waists, trying not to look at the bodies, trying not to think about what those bodies had been just hours earlier. They climbed the far bank and continued east, moving away from the ford as quickly as exhaustion would allow. Behind them, the sound of aircraft engines and exploding ordnance continued without pause. It sounded like a constant thunderstorm, a rolling barrage that never ended. By evening, they had reached a small village, whose name Weber never learned. The inhabitants had fled. German soldiers filled the abandoned houses, resting, treating wounds, consuming whatever food could be scavenged from the empty homes. Weber found a cellar where his group could take shelter and tried to account for his men. 16 remained. The wounded artillery lieutenant and one of the infantry soldiers had disappeared during the river crossing, swept away by the current, or perhaps simply too weak to continue. 16 out of 61. And those 61 had been the survivors of a company that had numbered 143 men when they had landed in Normandy in June. An obrist from 5th Panzer Army headquarters appeared after dark, moving from house to house, attempting to organize the scattered survivors into some semblance of military order. The colonel looked 20 years older than his probable age, his uniform filthy, his face haggard with exhaustion and something deeper. Weber recognized the expression. He had seen it in mirrors. It was the look of a man who had watched his world collapse and was struggling to accept that the collapse was real. The colonel's orders were simple. Continue the withdrawal. Reach the Seine. Cross at any available point. Proceed to collection areas on the far bank where surviving units would be reconstituted. Avoid roads during daylight. Move only at night or in weather that grounded Allied aircraft. Above all, maintain discipline. The Wehrmacht was not defeated. This was a tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions. The situation was serious but not catastrophic. Weber listened to the colonel's speech and felt nothing. Not anger, not despair, just a vast emptiness. Tactical withdrawal. More defensible positions. The phrases were meaningless. What had happened in the Falaise Pocket was not a tactical withdrawal. It was the annihilation of an army. 7 panzer divisions had entered the pocket. What was emerging on the eastern side were scattered fragments, groups of exhausted men without their vehicles, without their heavy weapons, without their cohesion as military units. That night, Weber tried to sleep, but could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw aircraft, diving toward him, rockets streaking from their rails, the flash of impact, the explosion. He had survived Stalingrad. He had survived Kursk. He had survived a dozen major battles and countless smaller engagements. And now he has survived Falaise. But something had been fundamentally destroyed during that withdrawal. Not just his unit, not just the tanks and vehicles that represented years of German industrial production. Something deeper. Some core assumption about how war worked, about what armoured forces could accomplish, about the very nature of modern combat. For 5 years, the German army had operated on the principle that panzer divisions represented the ultimate ground combat force. Fast, powerful, able to break through defensive lines and exploit deep into enemy rear areas. The tank, properly employed, was the king of the battlefield. That principle had been validated again and again across Poland, France, the Balkans, and the vast expanses of Russia. Even when German forces had been pushed back, even when they had suffered defeats, the fundamental doctrine had remained sound. Tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, protected by air cover, were the decisive weapon. Falaise had proven that doctrine obsolete, not gradually, not through some process of evolution and adaptation, but suddenly and catastrophically. In the space of 4 days, Allied air power had demonstrated that tanks without air superiority were not decisive weapons at all. They were targets. Expensive, vulnerable targets that could be destroyed at will by aircraft operating from bases far behind the front lines. Aircraft that could strike without warning and without being effectively engaged by ground forces. Weber had commanded 45 tanks at the start of June. By the time his company had been ordered to break out of the Falaise Pocket, 7 remained. Of those 7, all had been destroyed or abandoned during the withdrawal. 0 tanks had reached the Seine. 0. And his experience was not unusual. It was typical. The entire 5th Panzer Army, 11 divisions that had fielded hundreds of tanks in June, had been reduced to scattered groups of men on foot. Allied investigators would later estimate that approximately 500 German tanks and assault guns had been lost in the pocket and its immediate approaches. Some had been destroyed by Allied ground forces during the fighting. Many had been knocked out by artillery fire, but the vast majority had been abandoned or destroyed during the withdrawal, victims of the unrelenting air campaign that had turned every road, every ford, every choke point into a killing ground. The statistics would not be fully compiled for weeks, but the outlines were already clear. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had entered the pocket with over 20,000 men. It emerged with fewer than 300 combat-effective soldiers and virtually no vehicles. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte had suffered 60% casualties and lost nearly all its armour. The 2nd Panzer Division, Weber's unit, had effectively ceased to exist. Individual soldiers would eventually rejoin forming units east of the Seine, but the division itself would require complete reconstitution, new tanks, new equipment, new training. Months of work to restore combat effectiveness, and all of it would have to be done while Allied forces were advancing toward the German border. The human cost was equally staggering. Official Allied records would document approximately 10,000 German soldiers killed in the pocket between August 12th and 25th, with another 50,000 captured. Those numbers would be disputed for decades, with some German sources claiming more men had escaped than Allied records suggested. But even the most optimistic German estimates acknowledged catastrophic losses. Of approximately 100,000 men trapped in the pocket at its greatest extent, perhaps 40 to 50,000, reached the Seine. And many of those arrived as disorganized stragglers, without weapons, without leadership, without the ability to function as cohesive military units. Weber and his remaining men reached the Seine 3 days after leaving the ford at Moissy. The crossing was chaotic but less deadly than the breakout from the pocket itself, primarily because German engineers had established functioning ferries and pontoon bridges despite Allied air attacks. Weber waded into the water on the 21st of August and climbed out on the far bank as the sun was setting, marking his emergence from what General Dwight Eisenhower would later call one of the greatest killing grounds of the entire war. On the eastern bank, a clerk from the Army Personnel section recorded Weber's name, rank, and unit. The clerk asked about his command. How many tanks? How many men? Weber stared at the clerk for a long moment before answering. None, he said. No tanks. 16 men. The clerk made a note and moved on to the next survivor. It was, Weber reflected, an appropriate epitaph for the 5th Panzer Army. The scene that greeted Weber on the 22nd of August on the eastern bank of the Seine bore little resemblance to a military force. Thousands of men milled about in no particular order, most of them having lost contact with their parent units, many wounded, all exhausted. A few senior officers were attempting to organize survivors into provisional formations, but the effort seemed futile. You could not reconstitute panzer divisions from men who had arrived on foot. You could not restore combat effectiveness without the vehicles and heavy weapons that lay burning or abandoned on the roads between Falaise and Chambois. Weber was assigned to a collection point for survivors from the 2nd Panzer Division. Over the next 2 days, approximately 2,000 men appeared, representing barely 15% of the division's strength when it had entered Normandy. Of the division's original tank complement, exactly 0 had crossed the Seine under their own power. A handful of vehicles had been ferried across, pulled from the western bank by ropes, after their crews had abandoned them during the retreat. But functional, combat-ready panzers? None. The armoured division had become an infantry unit, and a badly under-strength one at that. A staff officer from OKW appeared on the 24th with new orders. Surviving elements of 5th Panzer Army would fall back to defensive positions along the Somme River, There, they would be refitted, re-equipped, and reinforced with new conscripts. The timeline for returning to combat effectiveness was estimated at 6 weeks, perhaps 2 months. Weber listened to the briefing and understood that the officer was describing a fantasy. 6 weeks would not be enough to replace the losses, 6 months might not be enough, and the Allies would not wait patiently while German forces reconstituted themselves. They would continue advancing, exploiting the vacuum left by the destruction of Army Group B, driving toward Paris and beyond. The truth was that Falaise had broken more than just German units. It had broken the Wehrmacht's capacity to defend France. The destruction had been too thorough, too complete. Before the battle, the Germans had fielded approximately 50 divisions in the west, enough to mount a credible defence if properly positioned and supported. After Falaise, perhaps 30 divisions remained combat effective, and many of those were under strength or poorly equipped. The core armoured strength, the Panzer divisions that represented the Wehrmacht's offensive capability, had been gutted. They would eventually be rebuilt, but the men who had survived Falaise, the veterans like Weber who understood from hard experience what Allied air supremacy meant, would never quite trust the armour the same way again. Weber spent the next week helping to organise survivors from his company. Of the 16 men who had crossed the Seine with him, 12 were assigned to a provisional battalion being formed from 2nd Panzer Division remnants. The other 4 were transferred to infantry units that needed replacements. Weber himself received orders to report to a tank training facility in Western Germany, where he would help prepare new crews for the rebuilt division. It was, he supposed, a logical assignment. He had combat experience. He knew how tanks were supposed to operate. He could teach the fundamentals to recruits who had never seen action. But what would he teach them? How to maneuver under fire, how to identify target priorities, how to coordinate with infantry and artillery. All of that was useless if the skies belonged to the enemy. The real lesson of Falaise, the one that mattered, was that tanks had become obsolete as a decisive weapon unless you controlled the air above them, and Germany no longer controlled the air anywhere. The Luftwaffe had not disappeared entirely. German fighters still flew, still occasionally contested Allied air superiority, still managed to inflict losses on bomber formations. But the strategic balance had shifted fundamentally and irreversibly. Allied aircraft outnumbered German aircraft by ratios that made meaningful resistance impossible. Allied pilots had more training, more fuel, more replacement aircraft. Allied tactical doctrine had evolved to make ground attack a science, with forward air controllers coordinating strikes in real time, with dedicated squadrons trained specifically to hunt armour, with weapons designed to penetrate even the heaviest German tanks. The Hawker Typhoon had become the symbol of that evolution. The aircraft had entered service in 1942 as a high-altitude interceptor and had proven mediocre in that role. But fitted with rockets and bombs, operating at low altitude where its engine performed well, the Typhoon had transformed into perhaps the most lethal ground attack aircraft of the war. Its 8 60-pound rockets could destroy any tank with a direct hit. Its 4 20mm cannons could shred trucks, half-tracks, and personnel. And by August of 1944, the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force had 26 Typhoon squadrons operational, able to maintain near constant coverage over the battlefield during daylight hours. The American P-47 Thunderbolt had proven equally devastating. Heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns, able to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, the Thunderbolt had the range and endurance to loiter over target areas for extended periods. American pilots had developed tactics called armored column cover, where fighters would range ahead of advancing tank formations, destroying German armour before it could engage Allied ground forces. The reversal was complete. Where German doctrine had once called for air power to support ground forces, Allied doctrine now made ground forces almost secondary to the air campaign. Weber understood intellectually that the lessons of Falaise would reshape German tactical doctrine. Future operations would place greater emphasis on night movement, on concealment, on dispersal. Anti-aircraft defences would be prioritized. Units would avoid roads during daylight, would shelter in forests and urban areas where aircraft had difficulty targeting them. But he also understood that these were defensive adaptations, reactions to Allied air supremacy rather than solutions to it. Germany could not win the war by hiding from enemy aircraft. Victory required offensive operations, breakthrough battles, and mobile warfare. And all of that required armoured forces that could operate in daylight, that could move rapidly along roads, that could mass for decisive attacks, none of which was possible when the enemy owned the sky. The strategic implications extended far beyond Normandy. The destruction of Army Group B had opened the way to Paris, which fell to Allied forces on the 25th of August, just 4 days after the Falaise Pocket closed. With Paris liberated and German forces in full retreat, the road to the German border lay open. Allied armies would reach the Rhine by September. Would threaten the industrial regions of the Ruhr and the Saar, would force Germany into a purely defensive posture for the remainder of the war. More fundamentally, Falaise had demonstrated that conventional ground forces, no matter how well trained or well equipped, could not defeat an enemy with overwhelming air superiority. This was not a new observation. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the early war years had played a critical role in German victories. But Falaise had proven the corollary with brutal finality. An army without air cover, facing an enemy with complete air supremacy, would be systematically destroyed regardless of its ground combat capabilities. The lesson would be reinforced repeatedly over the following months. In September, during Operation Market Garden, German forces defending Arnhem would learn that even well-prepared defensive positions offered little protection against sustained air attack. In December, during the Battle of the Bulge, the German Ardennes offensive would make initial progress during a period of poor weather that grounded Allied aircraft, only to stall completely when clear skies returned and Allied fighter bombers returned to the battlefield. By 1945, German commanders would routinely schedule major movements for nighttime hours, would shelter units in forests during daylight, would treat exposed positions as tantamount to suicide. The Wehrmacht had become a nocturnal force, able to operate effectively only when darkness or weather protected it from the skies. For Weber personally, the months following Falaise were a slow process of understanding just how completely the war had been lost. He arrived at the training facility in mid-September and began teaching new crews how to operate the latest Panther variants. The recruits were young, enthusiastic, convinced that German armour was superior to anything the Allies fielded, and technically, they were correct. A Panther's 88mm gun could defeat any Allied tank, at ranges where Allied guns were ineffective. Its frontal armour was nearly impervious to most Allied tank weapons. In a one-on-one ground engagement, a Panther was superior to a Sherman, a Cromwell, a 34. But Weber knew, and could not unknow, that none of that mattered. The recruits would take their Panthers to the front, would fight well, and would score kills against Allied armour. And then, on some bright afternoon when visibility was perfect and the skies were clear, the Typhoons would come, or the Thunderbolts, or the rocket-firing Soviet Sturmoviks if they were fighting in the east. And the superior gun, the superior armour, the superior training would all become irrelevant in the seconds it took for rockets to streak down from above and transform a 45-ton tank into a burning coffin. He tried to explain this to the recruits, but they did not understand. How could they? They had not watched an entire Panzer division disintegrate in 4 hours. They had not abandoned their tanks and run through fields, hunted like animals by aircraft that returned again and again until there was nothing left to destroy. They had not waded through a river choked with corpses while aircraft circled overhead like carrion birds waiting for fresh prey. The knowledge required the experience, and Weber found himself hoping, with something approaching desperation, that these young men would never acquire that experience, that somehow, before they reached the front, the war would end, that they would be spared the education he had received at Falaise. The war did not end. The recruits completed their training and deployed to the Western Front in October and November, where they joined the rebuilt remnants of the Panzer divisions that had been destroyed in Normandy. Weber remained at the training facility, deemed too valuable as an instructor to be returned to combat operations. He taught through the winter, watching new classes arrive, teaching them tactics and procedures that he no longer quite believed in, wondering how many of his students would survive their first contact with enemy air power. In February of 1945, he received word that 12 of his former students had been killed during a single afternoon near the Rhine. Their battalion had been caught in the open during a move to new positions. Allied fighter bombers had destroyed 7 tanks in minutes. The survivors had abandoned their vehicles and scattered. It had been, according to the report, nearly identical to what had happened at Falaise. The same weapons, the same tactics, the same result. Weber read the report and felt nothing. By that point, he had moved beyond grief, beyond anger, into a state of numb acceptance. This was how the war would end, not with decisive tank battles like Kursk or grand encirclements like Kiev, but with German armour being methodically destroyed from the air, one column at a time, until nothing remained. The final irony was that the Germans had pioneered the tactical concepts that were now being used to destroy them. Close air support, ground attack aircraft, the integration of air power with armoured operations. All of it had been demonstrated during the campaigns of 1939 through 1942. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers had performed essentially the same role in Poland and France that Typhoons and Thunderbolts were now performing against German forces. The difference was one of scale and sustainability. Germany had been able to achieve temporary air superiority over specific sectors of the front during specific operations. The Allies had achieved permanent air supremacy over the entire theatre of operations. They could mass aircraft at will, could sustain operations indefinitely, could replace losses faster than they occurred. Germany could not, and that difference had proven decisive. Eisenhower, visiting the Falaise battlefield 48 hours after the pocket closed, had walked, through scenes he described as comparable to Dante's Inferno, roads choked with destroyed vehicles and dead men, fields littered with abandoned equipment, the Dives River runs thick with corpses. It was, he observed, literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The Supreme Commander was not prone to exaggeration, and his description was supported by countless other witnesses. Falaise had been a slaughter on a scale that shocked even veteran soldiers who had seen years of combat. The casualty figures remained disputed long after the war ended. Allied sources documented 10,000 German soldiers killed and 50,000 captured in the pocket itself. German sources suggested that as many as 40,000 men had successfully escaped before the encirclement was completed. Both figures were probably partly correct. Many Germans had escaped, but they had escaped largely as individuals or small groups, leaving behind all their heavy equipment. The divisions that emerged from Falaise bore little resemblance to the forces that had been trapped inside. They had been destroyed as functional military units, even if many of their personnel survived. The equipment losses were beyond dispute. Approximately 500 German tanks and assault guns, over 2,000 trucks and other vehicles, 300 artillery pieces. All of it was abandoned or destroyed in the space of 10 days. The Wehrmacht would never recover from those losses. New tanks would be produced, certainly. Training of replacement crews would continue. But the combat-experienced cadre, the veteran tankers who understood ground warfare at the operational level, had been decimated. The Panzer divisions rebuilt after Falaise would be technically competent but strategically irrelevant. They would fight defensive actions, would occasionally achieve local successes, but they would never again be capable of the kind of sweeping offensive operations that had characterized German armor in the early war years. For Weber, the true cost of Falaise was measured not in statistics, but in the transformation of understanding. He had entered the battle believing, at some level, that German tactical and technical superiority could still influence the war's outcome. He had emerged knowing that superiority in ground combat was meaningless against an enemy with total control of the air. That knowledge changed everything. It rendered his experience obsolete, his training insufficient, his entire professional identity questionable. He was a Panzer officer, in a world where Panzers could no longer function as intended. He was an expert in a form of warfare that had been superseded by a new paradigm. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Weber was still at the training facility, having spent the final months of the war preparing crews for tanks that would never be delivered, for operations that would never be conducted. When the surrender was announced, his primary emotion was relief, not for himself particularly, but for the recruits. They would not have to learn what he had learned. They would not have to experience the 4 hours that had destroyed 90% of his division. They would go home to their families, would rebuild their lives, would perhaps never fully understand how fortunate they had been to miss the education that Falaise provided. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.